Alright, I'm Rank Earlier,
I'm Joel Balloon.
and we'll be breaking down the healthcare sector for you guys today. We get started for entertainment purposes. Alright, so the healthcare sector, it's weighted about 15% in relation to the S&P 500, and in our SIF portfolio with our holdings, currently we're about 14%, so about 1% of the S&P 500. This is a 5-year graph. The blue line is going to be the S&P 500, purple line is going to be the healthcare sector. So early on, about 5 years ago, you can see it kind of took off, went away from the S&P 500, outperformed it for a bit, and then kind of came back here. They were kind of basically just correlating by himself, and then recently has kind of broke away from it again.
So when does the healthcare sector outperform? It happens late in the business cycle when it's mature, and then also during the recession time, because people always need healthcare, right? So people aren't going to stop using it. So you can see here it outperforms by about 10%. This is healthcare right here. And that's during the mature point. So in the U.S. economy, the economic factors indicate that we are reaching the mature phase of the business cycle. Even though the Fed might disagree, everybody else seems to agree that we're getting closer and closer to a recession, like everybody's been saying for years. So that would mean that today would be the time to start investing more heavily into the healthcare sector because it is defensive.
Alright, so what industries make up the healthcare sector? So healthcare equipment and supplies, so that's going to be like your basic hospital tools, stuff like that. And then healthcare providers and services, that's going to be owners and operators of healthcare systems and services. Healthcare technology is kind of databases, IT of what they're going to be using to control that. Biotechnology is one we'll get into later, but basically that's just using genetics and the research and development of that to find out what's going on and develop new products there. Pharmaceuticals we'll also get into. Joel will get into that later, so I'll let him do that. And then life sciences, tools and services, that's going to be your research services, contact, stuff like that. Out of these also, if you look at their market cap, all of them, they range from about 60 to about 800 billion, but pharmaceuticals is 2.24 trillion, so obviously that carries the biggest weight out of all of these.
So for our healthcare holdings, we have Regeneron Pharmaceuticals, that would be a pharmaceuticals company. We have Allergan, Sengen, Eli Lilly, Center, and healthcare sector. So we're hoping to sell that investment and then invest it into an actual stock.
Alright, so looking into biotechnology, it includes companies primarily engaged in the research, development, manufacturing, marketing of genetic analysis and genetic engineering. So when we looked at Regeneron, they were big into this. So return on research and development is basically the biggest metric for these companies, looking how much they're putting into their research and kind of what is their product they're getting out of that. As you can see right here, this is kind of the time, the cycle it takes to make a product and develop a product right now with the FDA. So you're taking 10-15 years if you have a good product, and then 10-15 years later, if it gets all the way approved, you can finally start selling it. So their research and development is going to be huge. PEG ratio, we put that in there because you're looking for a company with some growth, so that can be measured with that. And then companies need a lot of cash in this. You need a lot of research and development. If you're just starting out as a company, like I said, it takes 10-15 years to develop products. You're going to need a lot of cash to back up all your research, all your development to get there. If you're a startup company, and sometimes there's acquisitions in this sector quite a bit, so a small company who maybe has a good product but just not the funds to do it, a bigger company will take them over and kind of take that from them. Hospital statistics are something you look at. I tried to get the most recent ones from the internet, but it said we had to pay for them, so I wasn't really sure.
How do hospital statistics relate to biotech?
You want to be looking at like if people are coming into the hospital, what treatments they're getting, if it's one-time treatments or they're coming back for two-time treatments, stuff like that. So for example, like Regeneron has eczema and like a cancer skincare thing. Are people coming in, are they getting it one time or are they coming stuff. And
Okay.
so then again, relationship with the FDA. In 2017, there were 763 genetic drugs approved, which is the most, and the FDA wants to speed up processes with biotech industry to get them out to the public faster. So obviously that's going to affect companies. The quicker they get their product out, the more money they can make with it. And then technology. AI, artificial intelligence, is becoming big for people to stream their data and go through it quicker. They can generate a lot more data from what their drugs are doing to their patients than a person who's looking at a computer. So that's helping them big time in realizing how their drugs are working and breaking them down through the people that they're affecting. I'm looking at Porter's 5 forces for this industry. So the threat of new entrants is going to be, it's pretty specialized in biotechnology, but you need a lot of cash, like I said, in research and development for this, so companies aren't going to be too big. If you're developing a product for cancer, obviously there's a ton of research and development on cancer already, so that's going to be higher for threat new entrants, where if you're developing a product for maybe eye care or something, that could be lower because there's not as much demand or research in that development. Power of suppliers, once again, very specialized, so it's not going to be huge. You're going to be ordering products for your labs and your development, so nothing's really going to change there. It's very low. Power of buyers, it depends. If you're creating a pharmaceutical drug, not very high for power of buyers, but if you're creating a drug that maybe a big hospital organization or a government wants, at least they have a lot more power to maybe distinguish who gets that drug and how much they're going to pay for it with you.
So I'll give you a little break on this one because you're Canadian.
Okay.
But in the US.
Is that racist?
Sorry if that's racist. Against Canadians. In the US, your two biggest buyers for any sort of pharmaceutical or like biotechnology type treatment are going to be Medicare and Medicaid. So they're government payers. And then you have private insurers who are also considered buyers. So you tend to actually have somewhat concentrated buying power, but it doesn't work because it's government buyers that are the big buyers. They're not super effective sometimes at leveraging their size. But you have interesting dynamics, and that's why people complain quite a bit about U.S. healthcare and how the costs are spiraling out of control and the system's broken because the buyer power is concentrated, but they don't use their size or to their advantage sometimes. So there you go.
So, availability of substitutes, this depends on the area, like we talked about. When we looked at Regeneron with patents and stuff, people are going to want to keep their drug, but where the biggest thing comes in is once a company makes a drug, there's generic, drug companies that will develop that drug once kind of the recipe is released, and they'll release it for about a third of the price. So that's where that can come in to be a problem for companies. And then rivalry, there's about 1,000 biotech companies, but right now out of the revenue, the 1%, like the top ones, make all the revenue, so very, very competitive if you're kind of a small company who's trying to get into that industry. When you already have the top dogs, you kind of control that area. And then quickly here is a graph showing from the biggest companies. This is just from pharmaceutical sales. The blue is going to be 2017, and this is a prediction for 2024. But looking at kind of the biggest company overall is going to be Amgen in the biotechnology currently right now.
So for pharmaceuticals, it consists of the upstream, midstream, and downstream for drugs and prescription medications, which means that they do the research to figure out what drugs need to be produced in order to fix a problem, then they create the drugs, and then they sell the drugs. So that's what a pharmaceutical company does. And they take the new technologies to try to improve their drugs. In the US, it's a little bit different because the competition isn't that high. That's not their main motivation. Their main motivation is to keep their market share, which is held by their patents. And as long as they can keep their patents broad and wide, it protects them from the other companies being able to sell their drugs. In Europe and other countries, it's not that case, especially in Canada. And the pharmaceutical companies that we hold are Eli Lilly and Co. and Allergan. And then the biggest one is Pfizer. We'll be talking about them later, but they are the largest. And And then metrics to measure performance, return on research and capital. So R&D is one of the big expenses that pharmaceutical companies make. So making sure that they are profiting off of their R&D expenses is incredibly important. And they don't always pay for all of their R&D expenses. Out of all of the patents in 2017 that were filed by pharmaceutical companies, 100% of them the government was helping fund the R&D expenses. And for return on equity, is the company getting their product in the hands of their consumers efficiently? It's just a way to make sure that they're using their money wisely. And then the quick ratio, the ability to cover their day-to-day operations. High debt is pretty common with pharmaceutical companies, so making sure that they're not overdoing it and overextending themselves. And then operating margin, how effective, how efficient is the company? So that's revenue minus production costs, pretty self-explanatory. And next is Porter's Five Forces. And for Porter's Five Forces, rivalry. Like I said earlier, in the United States, there's not a whole lot of competition, but there are new things that are being brought in to the U.S. Pharmaceutical industry that I'm about to talk about, and that might change. And the power of substitutes, the wide patents that they have sort of keep that from being a problem. But as those patents expire, it does bring in the ability for other companies to substitute with other medications. And then the threat to new entry. This isn't a huge problem. It's fairly difficult to become a successful pharmaceutical company. Like he was mentioning, 10 years in order to bring a product into market. And then the bargaining power of suppliers is not a huge threat. And the bargaining power of the consumer. As Kim said, the government is one of the biggest purchasers of pharmaceuticals for Medicare, Medicaid. And I mean, that might change soon, but we'll see.
Why would that change?
We're about to talk about it. So economic trends and indicators. Regulations is one of the biggest things that influences this sector. So the government comes in and wants to make sure that all of the products are safe and that they're not going to harm everybody. And in the U.S., it's really stringent and strict. In countries like Russia, not so much. They're able to get products into the market a lot faster. And then the lack of consumer confidence, that would be one of the biggest things that would influence a company. If bad news comes out, your drug is making your toes fall off, well, people are going to stop buying the drug. They're going to lose confidence and you're going to go under. Lack of new products. So out of the 78% of patents that were filed in pharmaceuticals last year, none of them are new. So there's not a lot of new products being brought in. A lot of the big problems have already been solved with these drugs, and they're not interested in going for the smaller market share. And then the wide patents, that encourages high prices in the U.S. And then biosimilars. This is what might change the industry in the U.S. In Europe, biosimilars are legal. They're basically clones of drugs that can be sold. So this encourages competition and brings it down to
I think you guys are getting biotechnology and pharmaceutical industries kind of a little confused here, because a biosimilar is the same thing as a generic drug.
Mhm.
It just is a biotechnology-based cure for something. So that's probably something that would have been appropriate to talk about in the when you were giving an overview of the biotechnology industry, and not when you're talking about pharmaceuticals, which are not biotechnology based. Okay.
So those are being introduced in the U.S. slowly. They just started to be brought in heavily last year. And then for the political climate, the current president had said that he wanted to push pharmaceutical companies to lower the cost of their drugs and things like that. We haven't seen a lot of that coming through, but with Pfizer, they did raise the price of 100 of their drugs in 2017, and within 24 hours, the president made them roll that back and cancel that. So while there is some movement there, we might see it happen more in the future. Let's see, and then I already covered that. Yep, and that's it.
Okay, a couple of things. So first, with the 5 forces, both of you guys probably would have been a slightly more effective visual presentation if you did something besides we just listed out what those 5 forces were on the slide. When I think about metrics, you tell me that these companies have a lot of debt, and then you picked ROE as an effective return metric, telling me about their efficiency, where return on invested capital is a much better metric for companies that have high leverage, because ROE is very subject to manipulation based on debt levels. And then some of the things you chose to look at, like quick ratio, I challenge you to go look at the actual like financial statements for any of your pharmaceutical companies. A lot of them tend to actually have very high cash on hand. And there's a reason for this. It's because a lot of them oftentimes are registered overseas, even if they're US companies that sell most of their product in the US, and they do that because for tax reasons, essentially, to avoid US taxes. And so they oftentimes have trouble repatriating cash, bringing it back to the US. There were some changes with the big like tax overhaul, but I'm not quite sure if that really allowed healthcare companies. Healthcare companies are especially prone to this, healthcare and technology companies, because they very easily, even if they sell most of their product in the US, can say, our headquarter is in Ireland. Because it's all just IP, it's not like a physical factory that they're moving. That's why it's something you'll see a lot. So like anything where you're looking at like their working capital, like their quick ratio, their current ratios is probably not going to be super helpful unless you're taking a non-cash measure of those, just because they tend to have quite high cash holdings, especially the large pharmaceutical companies. Couple other things I'd point out. I didn't ask you guys to go over the holdings. One of our holdings, Celgene, was announced that Bristol Myers Squibb is going to put in a bid to acquire them, and it was accepted. This happened over winter break. I decided to sell our holding on your behalf, which I very rarely make investment decisions without student approval, but there was a huge pop in the stock price, and our portfolio wasn't doing well, so I was like, all right, we're gonna do this. So just to let you know, that happened over the break. So yeah, I would think about some of those metrics that you're looking at. I think return on R&D is helpful. I would look at, like one of the things you guys brought up, there's this term that's like a thicket of interlocking patents. So you'll see, you guys kind of started bringing this up, that companies will have patents because they'll like slightly improve a process, or slightly improve the delivery mechanism for a drug, or slightly change the formula for a drug, and so they continue to extend the life of these patents for small changes on something. So it's not like a patent's typically 17 years. Oftentimes they'll have patent protection because they keep on updating kind of small things for much longer than that. In terms of understanding the value chain in healthcare, I think it is kind of important to understand the role the government plays, because they both are the regulator, and then another part of the government is also the biggest buyer, and they're the ones who negotiate prices. So to understand that part of the value chain and understand how those two things are quite different would be helpful. So I maybe think about that a little more. Okay? Questions from the class?
I know, because I covered the healthcare sector 2 semesters ago, and we focused a lot on like big data. Is that what you're kind of talking about when you talk about like the statistics? Like just having access to a lot of like patient information and stuff like that. I know that was something that me and my partner at the time really looked into, was the idea of big data.
I think for that, like looking at the company first to see what products they produce first, and then if we can correlate it to like data that will be done in hospitals and stuff like that, would be the kind of first thing, basing off what products they're producing first.
Okay. Okay, thank you guys.